lots of questions in the chat, so I'm going to try and pull them out thematically. And you both talked a little bit about understanding, partly from policymakers and others. And there's a question in the chat around essentially to what extent is there a need for training for policymakers, senior civil servants, others? If we sort of broaden that out, to what extent does developing that understanding form part of what you think we need? If I bring that to perhaps to James first and then to Cliff.
Yeah, no, I think it's absolutely essential, to be honest. I think from the interactions we have with, I don't know, policymakers, whether it's national government in different departments or in local government combined authorities, devolved government, yeah, it's pretty clear that like real kind of practical understanding of what cooperatives are and what they can do is very, very thin, even within kind of inclusive growth directorates and that type of thing. So I think if we were serious about, for example, I don't know, the Welsh government having a theory of change in which they wanted to achieve genuinely inclusive and sustainable economic development through big growth in the cooperative economy, they would need like those types of theories of change approach obviously need a lot of data and evidence and understanding of what are you growing to, what tipping points, what are the mechanisms involved. And I just think at that point you need a much richer understanding of what you're working with than we currently have. And just on things like, I don't know, the creation of legislation and regulation and for interventions for different schemes, essentially different sectors across the economy, quite often you find that like they're created in a way which just never really countenances the existence of cooperatives, and therefore they're created in ways which often create unnecessary barriers to cooperative entry or cooperative functioning. And if you were to ask for, I don't know, as we have done in the past, like say like almost like a cooperative and mutual impact assessment in policy making, which would kind of prompt policymakers to consider cooperatives and mutuals in whatever they're doing, well, they would still then obviously to kind of follow that through in any kind of meaningful way, they would need at least access to some useful information to help them understand what it is they're having to assess and be mindful of. So I think it's really, really important, to be honest.
Thank you. Cliff, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think it's important at every level, from primary school to business degrees. The lack of lawyers, accountants, bankers, people don't get trained. They don't get told about cooperative law. They get taught about company law. They don't get taught about anything other than a market-based approach to everything. And you look at the renewables field, everything, all the energy, or all of it, I say, the bulk of government energy is on market-based solutions. People are present here today are obviously going down a different route, but that is not shared by most people, by policymakers generally. So there is a great ignorance, and I think we don't help ourselves within the movement because we find it hard to articulate what's difference between you stopped on a street corner, what's the difference between the Co-op and Tesco's? We can witter on about their cooperative values and principles, and the person's walked off. It's taken me 25 years, but I think I would now answer the question, well, the Co-op's here, Tesco's is here for the benefit of shareholders or for private benefit. The Co-op's here for everyone's benefit. That is the street corner answer, but we don't articulate it like that, nor do we actually build our case around it and build our organizations around it. And I think that this issue of the method, the cooperative method rather than structure, is a really important one, because I think we're missing out enormously in this country by not recognizing a different way of doing business, which is not governed by contract law and all the arrangements, the default arrangements, which only recognize one approach to business. It's really important that we recover what I refer to as the Rochdale method. And people are doing this. And in our conversations and in our work with local government is extremely interested in this. because it has an impact. It is highly relevant in the context of procurement because you don't have a public contract. So yes, there is a massive need for education from top to bottom.
Thank you. And I think I should say as well, I know Co-ops Mutuals Wales through Robert Owen Day and other things are doing a lot of work around the curriculum in Wales. So there's perhaps a strand for the movement, others to pick up there. I want to open up a bit of a debate to stir things up. There's a few comments in the chat, well, at least one from David, one from Richard. For whose benefit do cooperatives exist? Richard or David, did you want to come in on any of your comments? Then we'll bring it back to the panelists.
You want to take lead on that, Richard?
Yeah, I just want to make the point that my understanding is the fundamental point of a co-op is for the collective membership, for the collective benefit of its members. If it isn't benefiting its members, both individually and collectively, I don't think it can really be regarded as a co-op. I think what Ian has been doing with the FCA is quite useful and helpful in terms of challenging retail societies about what proportion of trade they conduct with members. Although I would be reluctant to kind of strike off co-ops that trade less than 50% of their trade with consumer co-ops that trade less than 50% with their members, because I don't think you'd have very many left. But I do think what we're talking about is challenging. It's about the fact that public discourse and kind of received wisdom and, in inverted commas, common sense is not shaped by us. And there's a lot of, as I said in the comment, I just get really exasperated with people prattling on about community, which is all very well and good, but we should be talking about membership.
Thank you. Cliff, do you want to come back on any of that point? Or David, did you want to come in? Sorry.
If I may, Ian, I think we've reached a point where it's no longer possible for retail societies to do the sort of work that they were doing 80, 90 years ago in terms of enabling an understanding of what the movement is about. So increasingly, we need to be looking at alternative methods. And the national curriculum, wherever it might be, seems to be an obvious starting point, because what you're actually doing, in a sense, is institutionalizing the approach to the way in which cooperative ideas and so on, part of a progressive movement towards active citizenship. This is the primary purpose around our promoting Robert Owen Day, and we've been nibbling at it for the last 4 or 5 years. We've made a number of attempts to try and get this moving, but it's totally complicated by the complexities of changes that are taking place in the Welsh national curriculum at the moment. And it's very difficult to understand how people outside the system can actually contribute in a meaningful way. And the approach that we've adopted is by saying we're not about creating lesson plans. What we need to do is to make meaningful, unique, authentic materials available that teachers can actually use as part of the lesson planning process. And that is what we've been attempting to do. At another level, we've also been nagging in a very polite way our previous co-op education, Labour and Co-op Education Minister, Jeremy Miles, to do some work. And he came up with a proposal in March of 2023 for a Robert Owen Day schools, for a Robert Owen schools program. And this was a pilot in Welsh schools. We need to see how that will actually progress. I've got certain doubts about that. At the moment, we're actually exploring the way in which dormant bank accounts could actually be used in a way that lottery funds could not, to support unique materials being made available to schools. So you create a connection between community action, financial inclusion, climate change, and other issues related to social justice within the approach that we actually take to delivering the national curriculum. This is what we're actually doing in Wales. I've got no idea what is happening in other parts of the UK. We've tried to make connections elsewhere, but societies seem to want to work on their own particular patch. I thought it was also finally quite noticeable that neither presentation really focused on the critical importance of education as the way of bringing about the changes that we want to see. This will not happen through law. It will happen through us building a collective movement based on an understanding of what we're trying to do. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to pose a provocative question for Cliff and James. So, benefit of everybody or member, collective and individual benefit?
I mean, my take is it's primarily you start with member benefit, right? It has to be of people have to come together to create something which benefits them, but quite often at the same time in practice, that activity has a broader social benefit as well. And I think that's the key for me. Like it's not one or the other. It's quite often a combination of both.
Thanks, Cliff.
Well, obviously a cooperative is there for the benefit of its members. They set it up to provide them with something which otherwise they have no access to. So yes, it's clearly for the benefit of its members. But so every business, to an extent, is for the benefit of its customers. The business is set up to meet the needs of the customers. The difference with a cooperative is it's not there for the private benefit of its members, whereas Tesco is there for the private benefit of its shareholders. It sells stuff to you and me to make money for the shareholders. It's for its private benefit. A co-op, yes, is providing benefits to its members, but it's not their private benefit because anybody can become a member and they can leave if they want to. The members don't benefit privately from the surpluses generated by the co-op. Under the Rochdale method, the surpluses were a mechanism for getting to the fair price. It's not about sharing profit. So there's no private benefit to the members of a co-op. And they don't get a private benefit by watching the value of their shares increasing like you do if you've got shares in Tesco. So the big difference is that it's for the benefit of the members, whoever they are, including future generations. And I think the trap we've all fallen into is the use of language. The benefit of members is company law language, and it's been there for decades in the case law. Everybody knows before the Companies Act 2006 put it into legislation that a company is there for the benefit of its members, i.e. shareholders. And what's happened is that the movement has lazily taken over that language, thinking, oh, well, that must be right because that sounds like what we do in co-ops. It's not cooperative language. Co-ops are there for the benefit of the people who need the services, and it's the current members, it's the future members, it's anybody who needs it. And so I think that we really should be careful with our language and keep to the sort of hard underlying principles, which is to do with the purpose.
Thank you. There's a strand of a few questions. I think it's probably worth not glossing over the how members get the benefit as well, in terms of member needs are met through their participation in the cooperative rather than capital accumulation and return on that. There's a couple of questions in the chat with some discussion on them just before I bring it back to the education point. So should everything be a co-op, or are there some models that co-ops are particularly well suited to and some that co-ops are perhaps less well suited to? What are your aspirations around that? Perhaps James first.
Yeah, I mean, I've been doing some analysis of the types of cooperatives that have formed over the past 5 years. What type in terms of, are they community owned, worker owned, etc., and also what, where have the hotspots been in sector? And I suppose, looking back over recent history provides some insight, but it doesn't mean that the next 5 years needs to be exactly the same. But I think there are there's obviously something going on in this country at the moment. When I say this country, I mean the UK, but particularly you can point to that in terms of Wales as well, around the use of particularly the community cooperative model to address what you could describe as forms of market failure, particularly rural market failure, or to enable communities to make things happen that might not happen otherwise, or might not happen in such a beneficial way otherwise. And in areas such as like land, property ownership, housing, for example, I think there's definitely big opportunities to harness more in this country the power of cooperatives in food production and supply chains. And I think we just definitely don't make the most of cooperative farmer to farmer cooperation or other types of cooperative in our food system at all. And I think if you look at international examples, we definitely could. I think there's going to be a big use of cooperative structures in some aspects of net zero transition, obviously in terms of renewable energy generation, but not just that. I think the areas like retrofit, enabling business collaboration to decarbonize, driving forms of behavioral change amongst households and within businesses. I think there's definitely a big role for cooperatives within that. Some forms of infrastructure development. I think there are some really interesting examples of cooperatives around the country which are enabling some types of infrastructure to be developed in ways that aren't happening otherwise, whether that's broadband and fiber or EV charging. I think there's definitely some interesting examples there. Culture and creative industries, particularly like the cultural foundations of our creative industries in this country, whether that's things like grassroots music venues, etc. I think there's definitely, again, which I think there's an element of market failure, or you could describe it that way, involved in there, where there are cooperative solutions can make things happen which would not happen otherwise. Care, for sure, I think is one. And then there are some contexts rather than I think sectors where I think there's definitely a lot of potential. So business succession, obviously, we've seen a huge rise of community ownership as a way to sustain enterprise and assets that might otherwise be lost, but also there's been huge growth in employee ownership. A lot of that could be made more democratic, I think, and more cooperative. Yeah, I think those are just some of the areas where I think there's definitely either already is in the data in the last 5 years, or based on what's going on in other parts of the world, huge potential for people to use the cooperative method, as Cliff calls it. Are there any areas where it wouldn't really work? Well, I suppose we have seen that attempts to compete with venture capital backed platform businesses on their own game in their own way has proven extremely challenging. That's not to say there might not be cooperative ways around that in the long run in terms of using federated models, etc., that type of thing. But I think there are certainly industries that are where the game, if you like, is to grow really big and capture markets and dominate, fueled by venture capital. It's quite hard to see at the moment how the cooperative model can operate within that. So that's certainly, I think, one area where I'd perhaps see. Obviously, we wouldn't like to see cooperatives developing, I don't know, weapons of mass destruction either, I suppose. Just to throw that in, but that's probably more a personal one.
Thank you. Cliff, was very briefly, I'm conscious of time. Is there anything you wanted to add to either of those columns?
Yeah, all very well put, James. I agree with all of that. I think I would say cooperatives need to be enabled in every area where the market is failing. And where the market is failing and where cooperation offers something different, then it should be encouraged. And James refers to infrastructure. CNI is an organization providing digital infrastructure, a carbon fiber network in regions, and it is using the Rochdale method. It is the member, there are no contracts between those providing access to their land and those who are getting access to unlit fiber. It is done through the rules of the cooperative. And so CNI is a profoundly innovative organization, and that's the sort of thing that we should be really focusing on and using as examples, I think.
Thank you. Just to keep everything to time, I'm going to bring in Dan, Richard, and then Ian for up to 1 minute each, and then I'll bring in James and then Cliff for any concluding remarks, and I will forego the minutes I've been giving for the chairs summing up, to keep us time and to give more time to the floor. So Dan, then Richard, then Ian, to 1 minute each. Dan.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, just on the educational side, yeah, it's just to mention that what Marianne said, that yeah, we donate £500 of shares to each of the schools where we've got solar panels. So it's just part of the ethos of the project, and I think it comes back to Cliff's point about the co-ops are there to try and benefit everybody. And not for private benefit. The schools get a small income. We should think about whether it's possible to set up a sort of competition to get them to develop further projects on the back of the interest that they get paid. Our education program is more focused, to be honest, on the sort of climate change work, because that's the priority of the schools, rather than sort of particularly talking about co-ops. But is there something that we're looking to develop? And I think Compass in Wales have done a film about Robert Owen and the way that co-ops can get involved in tackling climate change. And they came up to our wind farm as part of that. They brought children up from Penarail Comprehensive. So that was a good visit. And I think that film is going to be launched in the next couple of months. And hopefully that will be a useful resource within the national curriculum that within Wales that David mentioned as a kind of example of how Welsh co-ops can try and do something. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Richard, following that spirit with equal brevity.
Yes, I remember back in 2013 at the height of the Co-op bank crisis, Ian Snaith at the Co-op Fortnight lecture blowing the myth that you can't run a bank as a co-op and pointing out that it's the one thing that the Act sets out in detail how to do as a co-op, but yet it's never been done. We've had banks run as subsidiaries of co-ops, we've had mutuals like building societies. I know David's been doing good work with others in Wales about a mutual bank for Wales. I'm just curious as to why panelists think that we've never had a proper co-op bank, unlike most other European countries.
Nice, easy one for the panelists to come back to in a few minutes. Ian?
Well, picking up on James's point about weapons of mass destruction and co-ops, I'm involved in New Lucas Plan, and the Lucas workers came up with a framework that they called socially useful production. Instead of blowing the world up, you actually fix it. And I'm just wondering whether anybody has looked at whether community benefit might be extended towards socially useful production for co-ops.
Thank you. I'll bring in James first for any concluding remarks and responses to those, which will give Cliff an extra 30 seconds to think of an answer to co-op banking under the legislation. James.
Sure. Yeah. So education. No, it definitely is important. I think I would have mentioned it if I ever had a bit more time, but perhaps I should have mentioned it with the time that I allotted myself, because it is important. And we're going to be running working with Co-op College on a roundtable at Co-op Congress to try and explore what the kind of advocacy influencing angle of improving education for around cooperatives could be. So we are planning to do something on that. I think on cooperative banking, I mean, I don't know the historical reasons, but I mean these days you just wouldn't be able to raise the regulatory capital with the tools that you currently have. Certainly not in the Societies Act to set up a bank, and that's one of the problems that I think we have these days, at least, certainly post Basel Accords.
Thank you, Cliff.
Yeah, 30-second answer, Richard, is that the capital provisions in the 2014 Act can't meet with the regulatory requirements, which is why Avon Mutual abandoned the idea of using a cooperative structure and is now working with a PLC structure that we have written based on cooperative values and principles, and changing the purpose of a PLC to the common good from private benefit. Yes, I agree education is crucially important, and I'm sorry, David, I hadn't realized that you wanted us to cover it in the presentation, which is why I didn't mention it. But if we can't explain cooperation to primary school children, we should pack our bags and go home. So if anybody wants me to come and talk to a primary school, let me know. I would happily do so. It's really interesting explaining cooperation to young people. I love doing it, and we should all be prepared to do that. So yeah, that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher.
Thank you, Ian. Just wanted to ask a question then to both James and Cliff, really, about reference to Italy and this here, for me at least, of a Marcora Law in Italy, where the employees get the opportunity to buy the business and therefore take it into a cooperative ownership for themselves, where an owner is either retiring or wants to sell the business, wants to get out of the business. I wonder to what extent is that a legal change that we could do similarly in the UK for our benefit?
My answer, Cooperatives UK's answer, is not so much the Marcora Law itself, but the preferential right to bid, right to buy rights that exist for workers in Italy. I think could certainly be beneficial and could certainly be used in the UK to support more worker buyouts. Community buyouts legislation in some parts of the United Kingdom anyway has definitely enabled some of those types of ownership transition to happen. So yeah, I think it could certainly apply as well in the UK. But I don't think it's necessarily Marcora specifically. It's more the rights to bid, rights to buy that I think are the most important there.
Thank you, Cliff.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, James. I think that from Nathan's point of view, this comes back to as many of these points do come back to definition. Anchoring a clear definition gives government something to latch onto, and that's important. But actually, requiring the opportunity to be given to workers, the workforce, is not within the 2014 Act, but I think as in other jurisdictions, I mean, it started in Argentina, didn't it, in the early noughties, and it's an eminently sensible approach, and I think we should be behind it. Yeah.
Thank you, and that leads us back perfectly to the link back between what we've been talking about and the work of the Law Commission and the role of law within the wider context of the development of the movement. David, I think we're at time, are we? Or
you've got 4 minutes, maybe, to put an FCA perspective on the conversation. I don't know. You've got a lot of experience there.
I think that this conversation has been fascinating. I think it shows the breadth and depth of the cooperative movement in terms of its structures, what it's doing on the ground in practice, and yeah, there's a rich variety of international context to draw on as well. I think it'll be exciting to see where the work of the Law Commission goes and what the subsequent response of government is to that, and we look forward to kind of continuing to engage in that. And in the meantime, we're happy to continue to engage with the wide variety of co-ops we have registered here in Great Britain and Northern Ireland under the 2 different pieces of legislation, and the rest of the mutual societies sector, I should say as well. We've got the building societies, credit unions, friendly societies that constitute a broader landscape as well. I've put a link to a chat and a publication we publish each May, so we're in the month to publish the next one, which gives you some of the work we've done in the FCA and gives a link to something Richard mentioned about member economic participation and democratic control. So I'm sure you will all be primed and ready and waiting eagerly for the next annual update from the FCA and the mutual registration function. But no, thank you for that. It's certainly been fascinating, and it's really useful for us to hear this, and we're very happy to engage in these things. And it's great to hear from James and Cliff here, who I think we're often in lots of meetings together, so it's good to have something with a broad discussion on this topic as well. So thank you to David and to Christopher for organising this.
Chris, you've got your hand up.
Yeah. One final question, if I may, then, Ian. Simply, apart from final thoughts, a general election just ahead of us. Do either of our presenters have a thought where we could get an advantage with using the general election? Thank you.
I definitely have no thoughts. So I'm going to bring this to James.
Yes, obviously. I mean, look, we've set out a policy platform backed by all of our largest members and 100 smaller members and individuals, which sets out what we think our policy priorities would be for any future government and why cooperatives could contribute to inclusive, sustainable growth. Obviously, I think obviously Cooperatives UK is a politically independent organisation, but I think it's clear from the mood music coming out of some parties that some parties are more interested in the contribution of cooperative growth than others, and we are actively working to to be ready with detail and a strong partnership if depending on the outcome of an election. Leave it there.
Thank you. David, am I handing back to you to close?
I think that would be the role of Christopher Hall, who was our chair.
Christopher.
Okay, well, firstly, I just want to say thank you, Ian, for chairing that session for us so skillfully, much appreciated. And thank you to our presenters, Cliff Mills and James Wright, who have concluded our Co-ops and Mutuals Wales event for today. I hope everyone has a good weekend, and some of us will have a view on the Eurovision Song Contest, either to join and participate or to avoid it like the plague. Whichever you take, I hope you have a good weekend. And we do have another event coming up, another Zoom event, 6th of July, and that will include a presentation from Anne Pettifer looking at the Green New Deal. At that point, I want to thank everybody for participating, and goodbye.